First of all, and on behalf not only of myself but my co-organizer, CLACS Professor Rafael Sanchez, I'd like to thank Ada for inviting us to organize this series, and of course to thank our funders at the U.S. Department of Education. The theme of the series is patrimony, space, and performance in Latin American cities. In this series of colloquia, we aim to query Latin American cities as sites for the performance and contestation of authority, rights, and personhood. Some of the questions we hope to answer are these. Are Latin American cities palimpsests of social memory, haunted by the coloniality of social relations bound into their structures? How do their 16th century roles as global cities of the first globalization play into their siting within 21st century global networks? How have gated communities, urban renewal, or UNESCO patrimony programs reshaped them as theaters of signification? What are the implications of social movements seeking reversion of sovereignty and of patrimony, or of rising rates of violence and fear, as well as vigilantism? Each talk in the series, the rest of which will begin at 5 p.m., mostly in this room except for the last one, is followed by brief comments by a discussant to help open up broader discussion. Thomas Bender, University Professor of the Humanities and Professor of History here at NYU, will respond to today's presentation. Professor Bender is a much published, highly respected, and established figure in urban studies with a focus on global cities that's been really a long-running asset to NYU. Today's speaker is Saskia Sassen. She's the Robert S. Lynd Professor of Sociology and co-director of the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University. She's received several honors and awards, most recently a doctor honoris causa from Delft University and from DePaul University. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a member of the National Academy of Sciences panel on cities, and chaired the Information Technology and International Cooperation Committee of the Social Science Research Council in the United States. She's written for The Guardian, The New York Times, Le Monde, the International Herald Tribune, Newsweek International, OpenDemocracy.net, Vanguardia, Clarín, the Financial Times, and HuffingtonPost.com, the one I most often read, among others. Saskia Sassen's research and writing focuses on globalization, including social, economic, and political dimensions, immigration, and global cities, including cities and terrorism, as well as the new network technologies and changes within the liberal state that result from current transnational conditions. In her research, she's focused on the unexpected and the counterintuitive as a way to cut through established truths. Her 3 major books have each sought to demolish a key established truth. Thus, in her first book, The Mobility of Labor and Capital, published by Cambridge University Press in 1988, she showed how foreign investment in less developed countries can actually raise the likelihood of emigration. This went against established notions that such investment would retain potential immigrants. In her second book, The Global City, published by Princeton University Press in 91 and a second edition in 2002, she showed how the global economy, far from being placeless, has and needs very specific territorial insertions, and that this need is sharpest in the case of highly globalized and electronic sectors, such as finance. This went against established notions at the time that the global economy transcended territory and its associated regulatory umbrellas. In her most recent book, Territory, Authority, Rights, From Medieval to Global Assemblages, again at Princeton University Press in 2006, she shows that the foundational transformations afoot today take place largely inside core and thick national environments. This allows her to explain that some of the changes inside liberal states, most evident in the USA, but also increasingly in other countries, are not distortions or anomalies, but are the result of these foundational transformations inside the state apparatus. Most of our speakers are historians and anthropologists whose work focuses on matters directly connected with particular Latin American cities. Professor Sassen, however, is a sociologist whose sociologies of history challenge suspect certainties about major moments of transformation, such as the one we now seem to be undergoing. Her latest book, Territory, Authority, and Rights from Medieval to Global Assemblages, raises for our contemplation a link in assemblages of territory, sovereignty, and self-governance that has been backgrounded in most discussions of the rise of the nation-state and of the denationalizing global moment, the role played by municipal charters by which kings of the medieval era delegated sovereignty through instruments that tied state effects to municipal governance, and the civilized to the civic. Given the centrality of the chartered territorial municipality to the Spanish Empire, and hence to its colonial projects in the Americas, although not so much perhaps for post-independence nation-states, it's more than fitting that she opens our series. Her title today is The Urbanizing of Global Challenges. Can Cities Reinvent Their Civic Capacities? Join me, please, in welcoming Professor Saskia Sassen.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here to speak, and I really enjoyed your introduction. You made me understand aspects about my work I hadn't even thought about, I must say. Thank you very much. I really like that. I'm just going to talk. There are several papers that are the background, and if one of you is absolutely really determined to get all the details, I will mail you all of those papers, or we can put them on a website or something. But the starting point is a proposition that is highly imperfect, that can be easily demolished, but it is a working proposition that helps me frame what I want to say. And one phrasing for that proposition is that at their best, cities have transformed conflict into the civic. Thereby I'm saying two things, that the civic is not simply a matter of great design, though I think great design helps a lot, but that the civic comes out of conflict. You either fail or you succeed. One elementary way of putting it, to simplify matters for the purpose of this talk, when you succeed, you make the civic. If you fail, you have conflicts, etc. in the city. You have racializing, etc. The second proposition, the second element of this proposition, that I think that today, and it's partly working hypotheses, again, you need a framing, that today cities are losing this capacity to transform conflict into the civic. And what we're left with are conflicts and inequalities and forms of economic inequality that are a way, kind of violence that kills. It kills with a long temporality, 20 years, 10 years, but it kills. Now, my hope, of course, is that this is not true, that cities are not losing that capacity to transform conflict into the civic. But I think it will take some doing, and I want to end with that kind of notion of what are the politics, what are the activisms, what are the actions that are necessary in order to contest this sort of degradation, if you want, of the city. Let me sort of begin by framing the matter as follows, to create a juxtaposition. It is in the logic of national states to militarize conflict. I'm thinking the modern state. I'm frankly also thinking sort of the modern city, because cities are highly variable, and if you move into the past, you have other mixes that come to play. But I repeat, it is in the logic of the modern state to militarize conflict. Confronted with conflict, it is not odd to militarize it. That doesn't mean that they always do, but it means that it is in the logic. It's the DNA of the state. It is in the DNA of the city to triage conflict via commerce, via existing civics, whatever they are, civic capabilities. So I do think that that's a very important distinction. Today, we have a peculiar distortion of both of these aspects. On the one hand, when national states go to war in the name of national security, chances are the enemy is what we call an irregular combatant. At its kindest, we call it that. There are other versions that are not as kind as that. And that means that war gets urbanized. An irregular combatant, you know, an insurgency, etc., urbanizes war. You may recall that when the United States was thinking of bombing Iraq, they were terrified at the notion that they would have to engage in urban combat in Baghdad. And they set, in fact, mock-up camps around the country to imagine what it would be like to have urban combat. So while World War I, if you want, the bigger the two armies confronting each other, the bigger the open field. Conventional army against conventional army. Same thing in World War II, basically. Today that has changed, so we talk about asymmetric war. It means it puts the paradigm of the national state on its head. The making of national security is the active making of urban insecurity. For the irregular combatant, the city is a technology for war. Now, this is the most dramatic version of something that I see as a tendency. Now, that tendency which has to do, one way of naming that tendency, is that we're seeing the urbanizing of a whole range of events, conditions, processes that are not necessarily urban or were not urban in the past, and also that are not necessarily urban per se, but they find in the city a critical moment in a trajectory or in a conjuncture or whatever. So I think that the Ciudad Juárez, or for that matter the Sao Paulo and the Rio armed conflicts that we refer to as gang warfare, I think that's a mistake to refer to that. We are urbanizing them in language. They are urbanized locationally. They happen in the city. But this gang is a profoundly, that's an urban formation. These types of conflicts, they're armed conflicts that use the space of the city, but they're not urban in themselves. Gang, the old-fashioned gang warfare, was an urban process. It was combat for space. What the, neighborhoods, whatever. What the, do I need this microphone so close to me? No, you can hear me, right, when I speak like this. But what we're seeing with these armed conflicts, and Ciudad Juárez is a good example, but any of these, is something else. This is almost more like a demonstration effect. It's another event. So I am one of those who thinks we should suspend the language of gangs. We should not urbanize in language something that is not urban, if you want, in its logic, even though it uses the space of the city. But for me, these kinds of urban gangs, these kinds of armed conflicts that happen in cities, I fell in my own trap, are part of that destruction. There are multiple things coming together that are unsettling I would say, the civic capacities, if you want, of the city. In my thinking, we're not going to return to European-style civics. I don't think that is going to happen. The challenge is, can we see in the horizon, can we actively make the equivalent for today's cities of that older civic? So again, I think that a lot of what we think of as the civic today was in its origins the civic, but today it is more akin to a visual order. It looks civic. The question is, how do we recover an active civic? Now, I'm using the term civic, but I don't know that that future possibility is properly going to be named civic. I don't know that, but the civic is a great word. It captures something very complex, and we need to simply pull it out, disembed it a bit from its European formation, from its European sort of origins, the language itself. So I like to, for instance, the word cityness. But cityness is not as concrete, it's not as clear, if you want, as using the term civic. But the main argument that I'm making is that I don't think that when we actively make, and across the world the making will be different, when we actively make this equivalent of the civic, that it will have the same texture as this original European civic. Now I want to develop a bit the question of what is there in urban space today that tells us that it is live, that something is happening. It's not just totally flattened. Yes, it's under threat. I think a lot of what the city is at its best, this capacity to transform conflict into something that is good and joins us, is under threat. But so the question is today, if I go with fresh lenses, what do I see? For instance, in the project that I'm doing on cities and the new wars, by new wars, I'm trying to describe a whole series of armed conflicts, but also other forms of economic violence, like I said, economic violence that kills, an extreme of inequality that sort of crosses the curve, and you can no longer simply call it inequality. It's something else that is happening. And the question that I ask myself in that project is a question that sort of opens up onto a possible problematic. And it is, why is it that today, when 67 people are killed by bombs or by a bomb in London, 123 in a luxury hotel in Mumbai, plus the acid train station and a very fashionable a coffee shop or bread shop, whatever, you get the picture. Just a limited number of people. That actually causes a kind of ontological angst ripple around the world. Every day, hundreds of thousands die of curable diseases in different types of spaces. We don't have that reaction. I think it suggests that death, we're comfortable with death. We actually are. Otherwise, we would go crazy. So what is it about death in the city? Not a car accident, not an urban death, but a non-urban death that installs itself in the space of the city. This is extremely unsettling to people. Now, here is another sort of, I'm full of propositions. You see, these are the beginnings of projects, okay? But another sort of, and when I say proposition, it's like a working tool, it's a way of exploring a messy reality and try to sort of navigate it with a tool, with a strong flashlight. So I think that the city, at its best, the city is our collective making. We're finished when we're dead, even if we believe in, that who we are now doesn't exist. But the city that we have collectively made is our inheritance. It will survive us. It is a collective production which, at its best, I always say that, at its best, gives meaning to a lot of things. Now, here I want to remind you of when the Buddhas in Afghanistan, where they were destroyed, every hacking of those two old Buddhas in the rock, you have an image of what I'm talking about, right? They also sent an ontological shiver through, and there is something about what we make collectively that has a kind of a power. Now, I think that today, the Dresden and Hiroshima option, in other words, pulverizing the city because you have superior military power, is not an option. Almost pulverizing, but not quite pulverizing. So I find it I'm trying to recover, I'm backtracking now, I'm trying to recover elements that suggest that the space of the city has a kind of autonomy to contest, to react, recovering elements of a DNA that marks the particularity, the difference of the city. That is really what I'm doing here. Now, one way of describing this, which is the way that I'm using, is the notion of a weak regime. So the human rights regime is a weak regime. The enforcer is often the violator. I'm just using this as illustration. The enforcer is often the violator. There's a lot of abuse. Those who become subjects of adjudications in courts are not necessarily significantly empowered. Often they're killed afterwards, or their families are. Weak regime. However, it is a regime that can contest power. It's like a thin, filigrane that does something. What about the city as a weak regime, the equivalent of a weak regime? It cannot destroy power, but it can contest power. Now, at this point, a very interesting question, and I'm assuming that this will happen in some of the presentations, is what is the city? Who is the city? We are talking a lot of enormously diverse elements, people, etc. And in that, it's also a way of valorizing all kinds of people, including the people who are not particularly powerful, who are not particularly whatever, empowered. So I'm really interested in recovering to what extent the city is a weak regime, the equivalent of a weak regime in today's world. The fact that we're horrified when people get killed in an urban setting in a way that we're not, with hundreds of thousands that die of curable diseases every day, including children, the little innocent, children, is to me a very important data in all of this. The fact that people with superior military power are not polarizing cities. They would like to. Partly the question of atomic bombs that, it's self-destructive, but there are other bombs that are not atomic bombs. So we know that Israel could have pulverized Gaza. I don't want to move into dangerous terrain here. This is always very, very controversial, but it did not. Question, would it have if Gaza were just factories or whatever, chicken farms? I don't know. But these are the questions that I have. I'm really interested in recovering a capacity embedded in that complex, almost third persona that is the city in our lives, because it is not me and my neighbor. It's something else. It's something that we have collected. It triangulates. So those would be, if you want, elements towards recovering a DNA in the space of the city that can resist certain destructive forces, superior military force, etc., that contests the possibility of an army like a military like the United States dropping a huge bomb, and sort of pulverizing like that. It just doesn't happen. They almost pulverized Fallujah, but always this notion. Now, there is another element to this picture, and that is the fact that even if when you have big Marines, armed people, whatever, they don't have to be American soldiers, but sort of soldiers with all their gear, even when they're giving lollipops to children in the context of a city, that's unsettling. There is something about that presence that is unsettling. So these are elements, I would say, for detecting a capability wired into urban space. It has to be a city. It can't just be, a stretch. I think a suburb would function very differently. To detect there a capacity, a capability that is vaguely reminiscent of something that we might call the power of the civic. So it's more difficult. I don't think it is that. See, I think we need other language. Now I want to, in the second half, to focus particularly on the question of making the civic. How have we done that? And again, I look a bit at history, but I'm not a historian. I just do incursions into historiographies. But history is natural experiment. History is often completed trajectories. It's very interesting to see what happened. And here I want to deal with the question of immigration a bit. I think the best historiographies for this really come from Europe, because of the specificity of European migrations. I'm thinking of intra-European migrations, which means that the immigrant, the outsider, was more or less your cousin. But we know from a lot of evidence that no matter the same phenotype, the same religious group, the same basic cultural group, the same basic language group, I'm talking about migrations that happened in the 1800s and the 1900s, actually more the 1800s in a way, in the 1700s. No matter how much affinity in some of these basic variables, still the outsider, still a real problematic about incorporating that outsider. Because almost the the iconic natural experiment today is Eastern and Western Germany, where the East Germans really were constituted as a different ethnicity, no matter that. Now, in there are multiple implications for me, such that, to me, that is evidence about something, which is that today, when we think that the problem is the religion, the race, the culture of the other, that perhaps we're fooling ourselves a bit. Perhaps it's something much more foundational and deeper than that. Because when they were so similar, they were also the outsider, and they were often treated with enormous violence, including killing, because they were the wrong Catholics. The Catholic Belgians and the Catholic Germans who came to build when Haussmann was rebuilding Paris, they were just hated, they were despised, they were treated very badly. And they were more, I mean, today, you know, we think they're all more or less the same group, the same religion, the same whatever. So I think there is something in that history where the outsider was so much affinity. You know, we as observers say that. But the outsider was still constructed as an outsider. Now, that is to me, a good case study, if you want, because it shows us that at all these times, these different cities, different decades, different, you know, historical phases, there evidently were always people who worked at incorporating the outsider. And we know that a bit from today's historic demography. I know it's a deeply flawed field. I am not a historical demographer, by the way, so I feel very free to criticize. No, I didn't mean it that way. I meant that I don't know all the, but you know, I'm told, let's say, that it is a problematic field. But still, it is very powerful evidence, you know, when the ends are so high. So when you see at the mixity of today's European population, you know that the them is now the us. You know, that would be the image. It was an enormous amount of incorporation over the decades, over the generations, over the centuries. So it's quite a bit of mixity. But that doesn't mean that it was ever perfect, never perfect. Always exclusions as well. The reason I mention this is because now I want to sort of focus into this particular question of what was made in order to make it possible for some to become part of whatever the term that might have been used, the community, the city, you know, the polis, the agora, whatever. But again, I'm thinking now of sort of the 1700s, 1800s, moving into the 1900s. Now, I think that this question of the reason this trajectory exists, of making the work of including, even if it is partial, is because that work expands also the rights of the insider, of the already included. I think this is a dynamic that has gone beneath the radar in a lot of immigration stuff and a lot of studies of racism, etc. That the insider, the one who's already in, when the outsider is incorporated, her rights, the legitimacy of her claims, all of that is expanded. Now, if you think, for instance, just to make it very clear what I'm trying to say, there was a time when the citizen had to own property. Well, expanding the right of the citizen to those, the right to citizenship to those who did not own property, did also expand, in a way, the rights of those who were already inside, of those who had a little bit of property, because it entailed elaborations of the right. Because suddenly you had the non-X that you had to incorporate into the X. No property, but you can become a citizen. That takes a lot of work. You are making membership. You are changing the basis for membership. You are expanding the basis for membership. For me, ideal examples of this dynamic of expanding, of including and expanding the platform on which all are, is our, I mean, it's not the usual notion of a civic, but public transport systems, public health systems. Now, let me elaborate what I mean here. If you're going to have a working public transport system, you need a pretty thin rule in order to allow everybody to be part of that. The fact that you just murdered somebody, the fact that you are a tourist, the fact that you are maybe ill with a contagious illness, all of that, you can't incorporate that into your rule. or you're not going to have a working public transport system. One could make a parallel argument for the public health system, you know, not the way we have it in our country, but say the way we have it in the UK, or, you know, in most of the European countries still. So that to me is a very interesting point, that to make something which could be thought of as a civic condition, a civic operational space, a public transport system, you need a thin rule. You have to keep thinning the rule. The more diversity you have, the more you're going to have to keep thinning it. If you don't speak English, it's okay. You can still use the subway, you know, that kind of a thing. Now, that is just an example that illustrates something that in many domains is much more elusive, it's much more complicated. But that is a bit the notion, that you begin to abstract from thick subjects, thick conditionalities, etc., to, you know, to produce more incorporation. And in that sense, the more outsiders you include, the more you are actually producing an altered platform that involves more inclusion. Now, I want to give you an example of the obverse. This is an argument that I often make in the contemporary situation, which is that when we exclude immigrants from rights, from options, from the legitimacy of having certain claims, etc., we are also shrinking our space. This is a very anti-civic, if you want, condition. And here's the example. When Clinton passed what was called the Immigration and Reform Control Act, which was terrible, in 1996, and I was a critic of that act, and it just had that name, Immigration Reform and Control Act. He actually took away rights from immigrants. I think this is a familiar fact. He also took rights away from citizens. That is a far less familiar right. That sort of always goes beneath the radar. So he took, specifically speaking, he took away the right of citizens, that's in the Immigration Act, to sue the INS in a lower order court. In other words, a court where we have sort of a kind of legal standing that we lack in a higher order court. We no longer have that right. We now have to go through a judge who has to legitimate our claim, etc., that whole process. I think that is significant. In fact, I should tell a story that my husband, some of you know him, Richard said, he always says that I work too hard, that I should have a hobby. I'm now telling a story about this thing. And so growing up in Latin America, hobby is a very ambiguous word. I still don't understand exactly what it is, a hobby. Nor can I detect his hobby. Maybe it's either, anyhow. So when this Immigration Reform and Control Act change happened, I said, wow, this is a window into a broader story. And it is the fact that we are losing rights. This is a very clear one, but there might be other ones. And so I remember that I wanted to then, I'm going to start listing all the rights that we citizens are losing in this sort of, if you want, neoliberal era. And I went back to my husband and I said, I have a hobby. I'm counting all the rights we're losing. And of course he said that is not a hobby. That was in fact not the idea at all. But since then I have actually, I am beginning to get enough stuff that I want to actually write a little story about that. You know, in the last 3 years, we lost rights. But you know why journalists don't pick up on it, and most people don't pick up on it? Because in our law, there is no such subject as the citizen. And sort of the Christmas tree effect, where the rights are the baubles. So if a few baubles are taken away, you say, my God, they took away some baubles. We are a subject that is really distributed across, we citizens, across multiple technical fields of the law, and embedded in each of these specialized fields are rights and obligations and all of that. So it's very difficult actually to if you just go to the law as such, you can't just find it that way. That is why it is so difficult. But I mention this case clearly to say that when we transform the space of the United States from a space of opportunity, especially for migrants coming from the global south, Latin America really, into a space, and it has been a space of opportunity, into a space of active persecution, we are also shrinking there's something that we are affecting it. It may take a while, it may take some contractual, sort of elements in a trajectory, but it's not good. Now back to the city. The city, and I begin to conclude because I would love to have a bit of a discussion. The city is a very significant space in this context because it forces a certain kind of cohabitation. You've got to. And I find it very interesting that people who were mayors, very sort of like Giuliani, that kind of politics, or even Romney when he was governor of Massachusetts, they were far more liberal, so to speak, vis-a-vis immigrants than they were when they ran for national office. So the scale of the city is an extremely interesting space. It forces something. Now, if we put together the first part of what I said, that the city as a collective production that is our inheritance over time in a way, and hence the horror, the city as weak regime that can contest power even though it can't destroy power. It can contest superior military power. It cannot destroy that, but it can contest a weak regime. And we put together this notion of the city as a mess. I like the word, the city as an incomplete formation. I think it always is incomplete. In that incompleteness, then, lies the possibility of making. Why do I say incomplete rather than diversity? Because a lot of the language that captures this fantastic aspect of cities, that the mixity of people, of cultures, of tastes, of, whatever. I like incompleteness because it suggests, in fact, an architecture, an organizational architecture that cannot be complete. Now, I make a similar argument for citizenship. I argue that citizenship is an incompletely theorized contract between the state and the citizen. And in that incompleteness lies the possibility for this very old institution, that is moreover highly formalized in many ways, to actually change, to alter, without finding the changed conditions sort of a lethal instance against its, its survival, so to speak. I don't know if people follow that, but it's this both an element of formalization, but incomplete. If it were complete, it would be too rigid, it would die. Now the city, we know it. Think, many big firms have died. Most of them eventually have gone under. I mean, states, countries, kingdoms, down, gone. Cities, look at the survival. Cities that are 3,000 years old. Cities that, there is something about the structure itself, that is the city, that gives it a possibility to survive enormous transformations in whatever the larger settings and frameworks are. So the city's serious stuff. It's not just a great place for us to live in. It is something, as I said, that is our inheritance. It transcends us. It sort of goes beyond. So this question of, on the one hand, weak regime, second hand, the making, the fact that the necessity to make inclusions in the space of the city, which, if you were on some sort of plantation, you don't need to. In a plantation, lots of people, lots of buildings, etc., but you don't have to. In the city, you have to, that sort of mixity of things. So final thought. Well, I want to elaborate. I just want to be sure that the second point is that in fighting for the few that we might be, in fighting for including the outsider, it is a fight that also is a fight for our strengthened sort of platform, if you want. So that, to me, these two dynamics, weak regime and fighting for the inclusions of the outsider, expands the rights of the insider. These are two very important elements. Now, the question thinking about today is, what is the equivalent of the civic today? And one thought, and it really is a thought, I'm working on it, but it's not a totally finished thought. My thought is that, what are challenges that are bigger than our differences? That means that if we address these challenges, we have to deal with our differences. And in that dealing, we are in fact making the equivalent of the civic. Now, of course, I immediately think about these questions that I started out at the beginning, the violence, armed conflict in the city, and asymmetric war, and also the environmental question, which is much more intermediated, I would say. It's more difficult. But I think there is going to be a kind of tipping point for many cities, for many great old cities, where they're going to confront. I mean, the floods in Pakistan are, that's a different sort. That is not what I'm talking about. That's not a challenge. That is a catastrophic event, like the earthquake in Haiti. That surpasses cities, that transcends, you know. But now the earthquake in Haiti might be a bit less, you know, might be closer. But I'm just thinking about cities that begin to feel the impact of rising waters. It's going to happen in many of our cities, many of our dear and admired cities. The question of, you know, of resources, this is beginning to be a very serious issue. You know, the kinds of conflicts we can imagine coming from a city, think of a city such as New York, such a dependence on electricity for all systems, all these vertical systems. I mean, there are going to be crises that are going to test the people in the city, that can become sources of conflict. So the question is, it's like those people, those few people in these European cities that said we are going to incorporate against all odds. They succeeded perhaps only partially, but they succeeded. They became a step in a trajectory. So I have the same image about these questions of, you know, the kinds of armed conflicts that Horacio that Juarez is at its extreme, asymmetric war as something that will put pressure on national states to rethink what is the meaning of national security. You know, those kinds of, we are beginning to see it. Look, nobody in this United States, which is a rather militarized imagination, I would think, nobody really likes, or the majority don't like, the war in Afghanistan. They also stopped liking the war in Iraq. This is very interesting. And these are also very long wars. You know, they never end. So that might be part of an erosion of, but something is changing, I think, because war is so extreme. We're talking rich countries. I mean, a lot of the conflicts, that's a whole other story. But the notion is that there are challenges that eventually are going to hit us, and they're going to be bigger than our differences. And that becomes, you know, one raises the ante that way, and that becomes, we either survive or we go under. Go under because the city becomes an extremely conflictive space, you know, a very dystopic place. And Ciudad Juarez is a good example of that. And so that is sort of, you know, the scenario is that there is something brewing out there, which we can call, you know, the environmental challenge, etc., that might just become, plus, you know, the other elements in Semitic War, that might just become the elements for a new kind of civic building that is not public transport system, but that is something else, that has one possible image is you will need the collectivity to address the challenge, whether you're poor or rich, whether you live on the high hill in Manhattan or here in the bottom, you know, those sewers are going to back up, etc. There's no escape. Every now and then I'm at a dinner party up there, and they think, oh, well, but we're okay because no, you're not. I mean, it's just a fiction. So will that force, will the threat of extremely conflictive spaces force some sort of collective? We all have to work at it. All never means absolute. But that is sort of one of the thoughts. You know, could that become the equivalent of the civic in olden days? Similarly to the question of inequality. I've written a lot about that. I don't want to really talk about that. But when inequality is so extreme as we are seeing it, I have some great graphs on these the new data on inequality. At what point does it break? I think that Manhattan came very close to breaking. And in fact, it would have broken if it weren't that a whole new population came in who enjoyed the new space, the new gentrified, the new glamorous zone, and triaged away the fact that a traditional middle class was feeling partly at least displaced, etc. So yeah, I think I want to leave you with those thoughts, and I do hope we can have a discussion. Thank you very, very much.